Good evening, Rowan. It's the 10th of October 2016 and it's just after 1 o'clock. And obviously, I'm making you my usual video at the end of the weekend to reassure you I haven't been seducing any priests, so you can relax once again. I mean, obviously, I've seen my beloved and he's just so gorgeous and I just can't wait to be with him. And we're going to be together forever the moment that you're in prison. He's just so handsome and sexy. And he's got such a lovely personality and a sexy voice from North Wales. And he's a brilliant theologian. He's nothing like you at all. Anyway, I thought we could have a quick talk this evening about, a question and answer session that was part of some lectures that you gave in Tennessee at an Episcopalian seminary there in the last week of September 2016. And several hours of videos of these lectures about Dietrich Bonhoeffer were uploaded onto Vimeo on Friday, so I haven't been able to look at all the videos. But I did look at the question and answer session because I do find question and answer sessions with you very entertaining, and this one was no exception. So I'll just get straight on with it because I have put together a lot of video clips to set the context of what you're saying, even though you're fully aware of all of this information that I'm communicating later on with clips from various videos. But I do want to mention once again, in relation to the material I've put on these videos later on, that you were in fact appointed Archbishop of Canterbury by Tony Blair in 2002, and you were the first Archbishop of Canterbury to be appointed from outside of England since 1414, and it's unprecedented in Anglican history to have any Archbishop of Canterbury appointed from outside of England, because the Church of England is the established Church of England. It's not the established Church of Great Britain. Wales doesn't have an established church now, although it used to be part of the Church of England until the Anglican Church in Wales rather used to be part of the Church of England until 1920 when it was disestablished. And the Church of Scotland is an established church, but it's not even Anglican, it's Presbyterian, so it's entirely separate. And there is also an Anglican church in Scotland, the Episcopalian Church in Scotland, but that's a separate province to England. So the Church of England is only the national church of England. So with that information there, which is important for information I've put on the video later on in the clips I've put together, I'll now move on to this question. So the person asks, what similarities do you see between the rise of nationalism in pre-World War II Germany and the rise of nationalism in the current political context in the US and the UK? And what might Bonhoeffer's ethics say to Christians engaged in 21st century politics? So that's the question, and this is your answer. The short answer to your first question is I see far too many parallels for comfort. I see across Europe and in other places a desire almost to withdraw from solidarity, to step back from involvement with one another, from a sense of common agenda. Right, so I want to talk about this in the context of something that you said in your lecture about global ethics, supposedly, at St Martin in the Fields. I think this was also in the question and answer session, where you said that people who were discussing before the Brexit vote whether to leave the European Union, whether it was a good thing for Britain to leave the European Union or whether it was a good thing for Britain to stay in the European Union. Well, they weren't doing it in a moral enough way for you, because you're the bastion of morality, aren't you? Being a psychopath and having the character of a rapist and an Illuminati shill and being partially responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people in the last 20 years. You were concerned that people weren't having a moral enough argument. They either wanted Britain to leave because they thought it was the best for them or for Britain, or they wanted to stay. They wanted Britain to stay in the European Union because that was the best for them or the best for Britain. And they weren't just being magnanimous enough and making a moral case for Europe. That was basically what you said. So you're probably being deliberately obtuse anyway, but I'll explain another bit of information for you that you don't seem to be taking into consideration. Just because, and it's very simplistic anyway to paint it in the terms of nationalism versus this kind of collectivist thing. This we're all singing "Come by Our" and we all love each other and no one's trying to exterminate us kind of attitude. It's very simplistic to put it in those terms anyway, but for the purpose of brevity, I shall just contrast nationalism with globalism for the moment. So, just because something is in the best interests of Britain, that doesn't mean it's detrimental to other people in Europe or detrimental to people in other parts of the world. And there is some information later in this video, which I've already mentioned, but there's someone else talking about it later in the video, about the fact that the formation of the European Union was already decided under common currency as well in the 1950s at the Bilderberg group, and really events in Europe have been manipulated towards that end and it's been brought in incrementally. So there is information about that. So even though it's in the best interests of Britain to leave the European Union, that doesn't make it detrimental to anybody else, like people in other parts of Europe. It doesn't make it detrimental to people in other parts of the world either. So it's both in the interests of Britain and in the interests of people in other countries as well, the vast majority of people. And really, ultimately, the only people who would benefit from the European Union are the globalists, because it's part of their agenda to be controlling everybody and exterminating everybody and using useful idiots like you to achieve that end. So that's one example of how it's in the best interests of Britain and British people to leave the European Union, and it's also in the interests of people in other countries in Europe and in other parts of the world as well. So it's not detrimental to anybody, even if British people were just thinking in a purely selfish way and voted in this way. That still hasn't harmed anyone. In fact, it's helped them. So another example of this is the Iraq War, because it wasn't in British interest to go to war in Iraq because it cost us an absolute fortune. Everybody was really angry about it because no one really wanted to go to war in Iraq. I certainly never came across a single person, I can't think of a single person I know who was in favour of the Iraq war. Most people either didn't say anything about it, didn't express an opinion, or they were angry and were saying, well, why have they gone over there and all this kind of thing, and this is all crap, then there's no weapons of mass destruction and they just want the oil and all this kind of thing. So nobody was taken in by this bogus pretext for the war. It was just nonsense and absolutely nobody believed it, in my experience. So it certainly wasn't in British interest to go to war in Iraq because we didn't want it. Cost us a lot of money, and then also like service people who went over there and people working for security companies and construction firms and so on went over there to Iraq during the war and after the war and ended up being murdered, maimed and traumatised. Well, basically because they just invaded someone else's country. So it's quite understandable that the native people reacted in this way. So it wasn't in the interests of British people to go to war in Iraq for any reason whatsoever. It was detrimental to our interests. And so it would have also been in the interests of the Iraqi people if Britain hadn't gone to war in Iraq. And the same is true of the United States as well. But I'm talking about Britain at the moment. But it wasn't in anybody's interest for the United States and Britain and some other countries to invade Iraq. So that was in our interest, to stay out of Iraq, not invade Iraq, and it was also in the interests of the Iraqi people. So that's another example of how something that was in the interests of British people wasn't detrimental to people in other parts of the world, and in fact would have been in their interests as well. And the same is true of withdrawing from the European Union. So then you say, and I say that as partly the result of economic chaos, the wobbling, if not crumbling, of the international financial system in the last decade or so. So this is the international financial system that's controlled by your bankster puppet masters who deliberately crashed the economy so they could be confiscating things of real value, like land, property and businesses, in exchange for their worthless fiat currency, which they make out of nothing, and then they lend it on interest to governments and people, and then they expect them to pay back interest on money they've just made out of nothing. And the money for the interest was never created. So the only possible outcome is a system of continually escalating debt, because it's absolutely impossible to repay this debt, and it isn't even a real debt, because the money that the banksters loaned, they created out of literally nothing. So they didn't have the money and then lend it to people. As soon as the agreement was signed to pay back the money with interest, then the money was created out of nothing. So that's fiat currency. So your bankster puppet masters deliberately crashed the world economy, and you know that perfectly well, and you call that the wobbling, if not crumbling, of the international financial system in the last decade or so. And then you say, I see it as panic because of the mobility of populations as a result of globalised economy, but also the result of globalised violence and terror and the displacement of populations by violence. So globalised violence and terror, well, that's the imperialistic invasion of other countries like Iraq and Afghanistan on a false pretext, and fuelled by propaganda provided by useful idiots like you, pretending that you were involved in the events of 9/11 and also the London bombings hoax as well, to keep this myth of Islamic terrorism in the West going. So your puppet masters are responsible for everything that you're complaining about. So you then say, and people panic in the face of that. I see it as people partly not knowing how to shoulder the responsibility for each other, and partly being afraid that they can't cope and pushing it away. So you do actually mention the word panic 3 times in the answer to this question, and it's not a word that you use very often at all. So I'm assuming that means that you're panicking. And I hope you don't think I'm going to be shouldering any responsibility for you, because I certainly aren't. And as I've told you before, I'm not your mother. Mummy won't be coming to rescue you. So you need to grow up and take responsibility for your own behaviour. Never mind shouldering the responsibility for each other. You need to be shouldering your own responsibility for the evil deeds you've been doing all of your life. So you then say, I think we're globally in a very, very dangerous time, if I'm honest. I don't know whether you're talking about the same kind of global that you were talking about in St Martin in the Fields. So then you say, I think the loudest voices in our world are voices of panic. So there's panic again, and fear and alienation. I don't know whether you're speaking astrophysically there. And then you say, I think it's a time for the church to be more than ever itself and understand what a ludicrous time-wasting luxury it is for us to give so much energy and attention to our internal squabbles when out there is a world that needs a witness to all of this. So I don't know what you're talking about, the church to be more than ever itself. It sounds quite impressive, but I'm not too sure what it means, because promoting Stalinism seems to be your understanding about the church being itself and getting its message across. So it is a ludicrous time-wasting luxury to give so much energy and attention to internal squabbles, which is something that the Anglican Church does an awful lot of, more than any other denomination, certainly. But when you talk about internal squabbles, it does make me wonder what else you might be referring to. And then you say, when out there is a world that needs a witness to all of this. Well, all of what? What are you talking about? A witness to what? I mean, you're supposed to be a witness to 9/11, aren't you, and other such things, and you're a witness about global warming, and you're not a witness of the gospel, are you? Because, you know, the gospel is that you can turn to Christ and repent of your sins and inherit eternal life, which is a message of hope for the world. I mean, obviously not everybody's going to believe it or even be bothered about hearing it at all. But you never hear you witnessing to it, do you? I mean, all you do is obfuscate and promote a certain political agenda, and then you keep claiming to be a conservative Christian, even though you contradict virtually everything that's being taught in Christian doctrine, and then you say that it's the opposite of what it really is, and this is what's always been taught when it's the opposite, and so on. So whatever witness you're talking about, you're not a reliable witness, are you? Because you lie all the time. So you then say, so Bonhoeffer's ethics in the 21st century, I think, does leave us with that very uncomfortable question. How are we now as a church to set our teeth, you know, grit our wills? Set our teeth and grit our wills. I don't know what that means. Isn't it grit your teeth? Set our teeth. I've never heard that expression before. Grit our wills to witness and to stand against the various paranoias there are in our world. So it's very paranoid, isn't it, to think there's a globalist takeover bid and they want to exterminate us all when they've actually published this and you can buy it from the United Nations and read it. It's not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy fact. They published it. And we've got the documents from the Bilderberg group as well. There's something about that later in the video about the European Union and the Bilderberg group. So you say, because it's not going to be comfortable, and well, G.K. Chesterton, I tell you naught for your comfort. Well, you quoted that at St. Martin in the Fields as well, so probably has some personal meaning for you. So you then say, but I'm afraid that probably is where we are, which is why for me, re-engaging with Bonhoeffer at this particular point in our history has been quite a significant thing to try to do. So Bonhoeffer was sent to a concentration camp. He was imprisoned by the Nazis and then executed before the end of the war. So if you're saying that re-engaging with Bonhoeffer was a significant thing for you to do at this point in history, it's probably because you are about to be sent to prison, and rather than the situation in the world, because actual reality doesn't have any meaning for you, does it? You don't really understand it. You don't understand anything as being separate from yourself and your own imagination. You can't tell the difference between fantasy and fiction. And you've also complained about paranoia before, and I did mention then as well, you've called me paranoid several times, and I did ask you if calling me paranoid had ever shut me up. Because this is how normal people learn from their experience, as you say. They see if it has any effect, and then if it doesn't, they try something else. Well, you've got virtually no strategies anyway, a limited number of strategies for manipulating the outcome you want. But I've presented facts to you, and you haven't refuted any of these facts with any evidence whatever. You just carry on with the same impressionistic bullshit, death threats, and obfuscation. Oh, but you did use the word fact twice to try and convince people that you were in fact disseminating facts when in fact you weren't disseminating any facts. So I'll leave it there for this evening because I have put quite a few clips together. But don't forget to be alert because I shall certainly be turning up to arrest you, and I am keeping an eye on your whereabouts, like you're at the British Library, for example, at a public lecture on Wednesday. So don't forget to keep your eyes peeled in case I turn up to make a citizen's arrest because you're a terrorist according to UK law. But I will have my steel toe caps on when I turn up to arrest you, so just tip me the wink if you'd like me to kick you in the balls as well, because I'm really, really looking forward to that and I hope that you're up for it. But in every other respect, I'm saving myself for my beloved because he's just so wonderful and sexy. He's the most wonderful man who's on the face of the earth. And I just can't wait to be with him. So, hasta la próxima.
Dr. Williams, what similarities or differences do you see between the rise of nationalism in pre-World War II Germany and the rise of nationalism in the current political context, both in the US and the UK? And what might Bonhoeffer's ethics say to Christians engaged in 21st century politics?
Well, the short answer to your first question is I see far too many parallels for comfort. I see across Europe, and in other places too, a desire almost to withdraw from solidarities, to step back from involvement with one another from a sense of common agenda. And I see that as partly the result of economic chaos, the wobbling, if not crumbling, of the international financial system in the last decade or so. I see it as panic because of the mobility of populations as a result of globalized economy, but also the result of globalized violence and terror and the displacement of populations by violence, and people panic in the face of that. I see it as people partly not knowing how to shoulder the responsibility for each other, and partly being afraid that they can't cope and pushing it away. I think we're globally in a very, very dangerous time, if I'm honest. I think the loudest voices in our world are voices of panic and fear and alienation. And I think it's a time for the Church to be more than ever itself and understand what a ludicrous, time-wasting luxury it is for us to give so much energy and attention to our internal squabbles when out there is a world that needs a witness to all of this. So Bonhoeffer's ethics in the 21st century, I think, does leave us with that, as I said at the end, that very uncomfortable question. How are we now, as Church, to set our teeth, grit our wills to witness and to stand against the various paranoias that there are in our world? Because it's not going to be comfortable. And, well, G.K. Chesterton, I tell you naught for your comfort. But I'm afraid that probably is where we are, which is why, for me, re-engaging with Bonhoeffer at this particular point in our history has been quite a significant thing to try to do.
All right, next, let's go to a question from B. Pi, who writes, regarding Jews, Nazis, Communists, Zionists, Masons, would you hazard undertaking the sorting out of fact and fiction in this arena at all? And B. Pi provided a link to a page that was claiming that Hitler was, in fact, was trying to get rid of the Rothschilds from Germany. Which I think is a complete and utter load of baloney, not only because Hitler was a Rothschild, the son of Alois Hitler, who was himself the illegitimate child of Maria Anna Schicklgruber, who happened to be a servant girl who got pregnant whilst working at the The mention of Baron Rothschild. Oh, an illegitimate son of a servant girl of Baron Rothschild, and his son ends up becoming Hitler. Yeah, funny how that works, isn't it? Hitler and the Nazis were 100% completely and utterly set up and made it into what they were by the international banking community and the international crony capitalists, including those in America. 100% documentable and on the record. You can look at all of the various connections, and they're deep and multiplicitous. So I'll include some links into some of what I'm about to just go over in passing here, because there is extremely important, and I think I'll have to put this together into a more coherent presentation at some point. But for example, you have the so-called Young Plan, which was enacted in 1930. It was part of the wrangling over German reparations and how are they going to pay, and they're failing in their payments. So how do we get this going? So the Young Plan was enacted. It was named after the president of General Electric at the time, who went by the name of Young. It was also funded into existence with the help of J.P. Morgan. And this Young Plan was enacted in 1930, just as the international banking system was collapsing. Germany went into its Weimar hyperinflationary struggle. So they had to give it a year off of reparation payments. It ended up repudiating the reparations and never going back. The Young Plan was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back during that period. So General Electric and J.P. Morgan helped to set up the downfall of the German banking system, which it led to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And I think we know that connection. But interestingly enough, one of the interesting aspects of that is that one of the bodies that was set up as the facilitator of the Young Plan was the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, in Basel, Switzerland, the central bank of the central bankers. And this is the body that, for example, was specifically identified by Carroll Quigley in Tragedy and Hope as the arm, the body, the institution through which the powers of international capital had a far-reaching aim, nothing less than the consolidation of total global control over the financial order. Or I can't remember the exact quote off the top of my head, but that famous quote about the powers of international capital having a far-reaching aim, directly talking about the Bank for International Settlements that was enacted as a result of this Young Plan. You can also look to Carroll Quigley who talks about how the Milner Group specifically was looking, which was one of the agents, the bodies that were created through the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes back in the late part of the 19th century to create the global secret society structure. And the Milner Group talked about how they had to get Germany and Russia fighting for each other, fighting for control over Eastern Europe so they could more effectively divide and conquer them. So they openly talked about having to set up, and this was years and years before Hitler even arrived on the scene. They were talking about how they'd have to build up a tyrant and set him up to fail in Germany. And that's, lo and behold, exactly what ended up happening. So throughout the 1930s, after the collapse of the banking system, the Weimar hyperinflation cycle, the rise of the Nazis, there's this myth that the neo-Nazis put out there that, oh, Germany turned it around by turning to National Socialism, and they cleaned up their banking and they kicked out the Rothschilds, and suddenly they had a vibrant economy, which again is total bunk. Their economy was 100% supported by Wall Street and the Wall Street cronies, including Standard Oil in cooperation with IG Farben, which created the synthetic oil without which the German military literally could not have functioned. You have Ford, you have General Electric, you have DuPont, all of those companies in there with their production facilities, with the American loans and funding flowing into them, IBM and the Hollerith machines, all of those connections 100% firmly embedded in Germany. And then, as Anthony Sutton has talked about, and again, you have to read Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler for all of the deep connections that he uncovered, but including, of course, things like, the plants and factories of these American corporations in Germany were specifically not bombed during the saturation bombing of Germany. So you had, for example, the General Electric plants, one of them completely unscathed. Several of the others had minor shrapnel damage and windows blown out and the like from bombing going on around them. Or the Ford plant in Cologne, the largest Ford plant in the country, and one that the Allies specifically knew was creating machinery and weaponry for the German Wehrmacht, specifically avoided by the Allied bombers. So again, we know that American industry and finance was helping the German war machine the entire time. There was the connections that lasted all the way up through the 1940s. We know, for example, the Bush family, Bush Harriman, the banking brothers were were helping to fund Hitler through the back door, and that's been, we've talked about that in previous editions of the Corbett Report. There's a very, very, very big picture that I'm attempting to at least paint the broad outlines of here, that Hitler was 100% supported by the banking oligarchy, 100% supported by the financiers and the capitalists from America, and absolutely set up to be the tyrannical dictator that they could fight against, that would cause, well, everything that World War II caused, including, of course, the aftermath and the creation of the United Nations, which came out of the S.I.R study group that was funded by the Rockefellers. I mean, there's so many connections here that even beginning to say this in a general way is so much. So I'll include, I don't know, as many links as possible in the show notes so you can follow the threads of the story I'm saying. And as I say, I'll have to put this together into a coherent presentation at some point. But the idea that Hitler was fighting against the Rothschilds and was really against the banking oligarchy is neo-Nazi propaganda, completely, utterly fake.
Leaked documents from the 1955 Bilderberg meeting discovered at the estate of a deceased member show that they were planning the European Union and a central currency back in the 1950s, decades before the EU was formed and their new euro currency introduced. The documents came from the personal files of former Labour Party leader Hugh Gaitskell, which had been stored at a local university after his death. They are marked personal and strictly confidential and not for publication, either in whole or in part, but were made available to the BBC by a historian for an investigation. WikiLeaks also obtained the documents and published them through their website. Gaitskell was part of the Bilderberg Group's steering committee and had attended the very first meeting in 1954. He also kept years' worth of their itineraries, which included his own handwritten notes about the different speakers and topics. Historian Dr. Hugh Wilford showed Simon Cox of BBC Radio 4 the archive. Here is a brief clip of that meeting.
This is from Hugh Gaitskell to his friend and Labour Party colleague Dennis Healy, in which he's telling him about the conference. He describes it as a rather special kind of conference, very hand-picked, with the proceedings private, and ends by saying that he hopes that he'll be able to give Healy further details, but meanwhile, would you please treat the whole matter as absolutely confidential, say nothing about it to anybody.
The conference papers show exactly what was discussed within the secret confines of Bilderberg. What's striking is the degree of consensus reached by those at the meeting on contentious topics like European integration. Here's another interesting, it's another paper from the first one. It's about the European Union. It's interesting here saying some sort of European Union has long been a utopian dream, but the conference was agreed that it is now a necessity of our times. Only in some form of union can the free nations of Europe achieve a moral and material strength capable of meeting any threat to their freedom. So this is 50 years ago saying we must have a European Union.
Over Europe, Blair had come up against the big, clunking fist of his Chancellor, and lost. Now he would try a new strategy.
It was when we were on the trip to West Africa, he asked me to say to Gordon that if he'd let him join the euro, he'd give him the country to run, which is an extraordinary and disgraceful offer to make, but there's no doubt he made it. There's no question about it. I think Tony's very much a fly-by-the-seat-of-the-pants man, and at that stage he was absolutely dedicated to getting into the euro.
Did you take that offer to Gordon, and how did he react?
Yeah, I said to Tony at the end, we'd had a meal on the plane, and I said, if you ever want me to talk to Gordon, and he said, I do, I do. So I rang Gordon, we met for lunch, and I told him, and he said, you're not the only one, this message has been sent by others, and you can't arrange politics like that, it's improper. And anyway, he breaks his word.
The Church will often feel resentful that it's not getting its message across. It used to be said, and perhaps it's still said, that if the Communist Party of Great Britain had had the geographical network and the resources that the Christian Church, and particularly the Church of England, has in these islands, we would have been a Stalinist dictatorship many years ago. Yes, I found myself, like so many others, feeling rather stunned the morning after the referendum, and wondering where we were going and what country I now lived in. The fact is, of course, that whatever we say in this overblown opinion poll called a referendum, we are actually involved with one another in ways that are not going to be torn up quick. Of course, discussing climate change will get us into discussing what democracy means sooner or later in a very acute and possibly uncomfortable way.
Welcome to Copenhagen and welcome to Faith at the Summit. Should good Christian people be on marches with big placards?
In a word, yes.
Of the world. It's a privilege to be with you today, and a privilege to be part of one of the most important events that we're likely to see in our lifetime. You, and I hope I too, are going to try and help our leaders to lead. How shall we build international institutions that make sure the resources get where they are needed? That, for example, green taxes will deliver more security for the disadvantaged.
You know the public will finish you. Is your brain really that miniature? You full of crap. Give yourself an enema. Try to change me, you're wasting your time. Now I got something much better in mind. Robert De Niro's waiting, talking Italian.
Catholics have the best sex.
Adelante.